Hello and welcome to Maths 1. This is our online week because of the public holiday, and today we'll be talking about lesson planning. By the end of the lecture today, you will be able to discuss elements of an effective mathematics lesson. You'll be able to plan for mathematics teaching and learning. We'll talk about curriculum links and also about integrating substrands. So your role as a teacher means that you need to understand several things. What do we know about how children learn maths? What do we know about their prior knowledge? In other words, what do they already know in order for us to build upon? What do we want them to come to know? So in other words, where are we going to take them to next? And how can we challenge them to move on to this next level? So you need to consider the structure of the lesson. You also need to see whether or not it fits with the syllabus outcomes. You will need to work out assessment strategies. So how do you know that the children have actually learned something? You also need to address the different learning needs of the class. So this is where our differentiation comes into it. It is important to cater for the emergent learners and for the advanced learners. In general, when we plan lessons, we plan for the majority of the class. You also need to consider engagement. So is your lesson engaging for the students? The more you can ensure student engagement, the more you can be assured that behaviour management issues will be minimised. So when we begin the planning process, you need to know where are your students going, how are they going to get there, and how will you know when they have arrived. So basically you need to have some curriculum knowledge. The school curriculum is basically what is intended for students to learn. It's usually structured in units. Now units can have themes. They may include many topics united by a common thread. These units may involve work for days or weeks, and they can be subdivided into daily lesson plans. Now, lesson plans are written by teachers to help them structure the learning for themselves and for the students. Now, research indicates that all students benefit from and appreciate well-structured lessons. Now, all lessons are based on curriculum. So what is intended that students learn? So sometimes the curriculum reflects learning outcomes relating to memorising information, and sometimes the curriculum outcomes are about creating a basis for judgments. So we've briefly mentioned a couple of these considerations. Once again, you need to consider prior knowledge. So what should the students already know how to do in order to engage with your lesson? So for example, if I'm teaching children the teen numbers, I need to know that they already understand numbers 0 to 10 first. I can't assume that I'm just going to move straight into the teen numbers. You also need to consider what concepts have to be mastered in advance to accomplish the lesson objective, what materials you'll need, what textbooks or storybooks are needed, what needs to be prepared in advance. So for example, if you're using technology, do you need to turn on the technology? Do you need to ensure that you've got the right app or program open? And you also need to consider any safety considerations. So for example, if you are outside, are you going to do a mathematics lesson outside near a tree that's fallen down? Could be anything very simple like that. Our lessons generally have 3 parts to them. So we've got the introduction of a lesson, we've got the body, and we've got a conclusion. Now the introduction consists of elements like the main idea. This is where we show kids how relevant the content is for their learning. We also set the expectations for the lesson. So it could be anything like how you expect students to contribute, how you expect their behaviour to be. I think it's also a good idea to engage in a brief activity in the introduction, because you're then setting the scene for the entire lesson. We also engage in something called modelled practice in the introduction. Now, modelled practice can sometimes flow into the body, but I'll just talk about it now as part of the introduction. So, modelled practice means you're showing the children what it is that you would like them to be able to do in that activity or in the lesson that you're planning. The body is the main focus. This is the longest part of the lesson. We need to consider how the flow works from introduction to the body. In the body, you also think about things like implementation and differentiation, and we engage in guided and independent practice. So guided practice is where we all have a go together as a class, so doing whatever activity that you're doing. Independent practice is now where there is minimal scaffolding and you give the children their time independently to work on this particular content that you're teaching. Our conclusion draws all of our ideas together. It's meant to be a consolidation of learning. So what is it that is going to tell you whether or not the children have actually learned something in the lesson? You need to have reflection in the conclusion. All right, there always needs to be reflection, because reflection time is what consolidates children's understanding of particular content. I also like a brief activity in the conclusion. Now, it doesn't have to be very long at all, and being in the conclusion, it won't be long, but the brief activity will focus on the content that you've just covered, but it's like a brief activity that consolidates what the children have learned. So it could only be 5 minutes or less even. The conclusion is also a time for you to consider what kind of follow-up lessons you might be able to now do based on what you've just covered. Okay, so now let's look at each of those things in a little bit more detail and with examples. So introduction, main idea, what they're going to learn about, relevance, expectations, brief activity, and modelled practice. So I want you to visualise a lesson that I'm going to talk you through now. So let's say I'm teaching my Year 1 class about number combinations to 10. So I'm doing like a Friends of 10 activity where we're exploring which 2 numbers add to 10. I might introduce the lesson by asking the children what we know about adding numbers. So when we add 2 groups, does our number become larger or smaller? I might then use the interactive whiteboard to roll interactive dice and ask children to add the dots together to arrive at a total. So this is me introducing the concept of the lesson. I will then explain to the students, so we're going to explore which 2 numbers add together to make 10. So I will model what I expect them to do. So I'm going to be working with 10 frames in this lesson. So I now show a 10 frame with 5 dots on the interactive whiteboard. I will ask, how many more do I need to make 10? I will then drag virtual counters into the empty spaces on the 10 frame. I then form a number sentence. So 5 plus 5 equals 10, for instance. That would be me modelling what I want them to do with their resources and on their recording sheets. Now I'm going to focus on the body of the lesson. So now children move to their desks, and what we're going to do is engage in guided practice in the body of the lesson. So what we're going to do is to complete one example together. So I might get out my 10 frame again, and I'll have 7 spaces filled in the 10 frame. So how many more do I need to make 10? So I would ask children to find the 10 frame with 7 dots in it and put their counters into the empty spaces. So I would ask questions like, how many dots did we start with? How many counters did we add? What's our number sentence? How many do we have altogether? Now on their recording sheet, I would then get them to find the 10 frame with 7 dots. I'd get them to draw in 3 more and write the number sentence, 7 plus 3 equals 10. Now each group of students has their own 10 frames and counters. Now they're going to engage in independent practice. Now when we say independent practice, it doesn't mean that they do things on their own. They're right to work in groups. That's perfectly fine. So now each group has their own 10 frames and counters. They're going to put the counters into the blank spaces in the 10 frame. Then they'll have a recording sheet and they need to draw dots to fill in the 10 frames. So for example, they would add 3 green dots to the 7 red dots already in place, for instance. Then they'd write the number sentence beside the 10th frame. 7 plus 3 equals 10. They will now finish the remaining recording sheet independently. For fast finishers, I might be able to play a game called Crossout. Now Crossout is where you roll 2 dice, add the total and cross off the corresponding numbers on their mini whiteboards. So in other words, I get them to write the numbers 2 to 12 on their mini whiteboards or a piece of paper, and then as they roll the dice, they've got to add the dots together for both of the dice and then tick off or cross off the corresponding number from 2 to 12. Now that's for my fast finishers. For emergent learners, I could do number combinations to 5 instead of 10. Right? I would also possibly not expect them to write the number sentence just yet. For more advanced learners, I might have 2 10 frames for them to work with addition to 20. My recording sheet might look something like this. So I have, for example, in the first 10 frame, I have 2 dots. I would then get the students to draw in another 8 after they've placed their counters into the empty spaces, and then I would get them to write the number sentence 2 plus 8 equals 10, for example. In this second example, 3 plus 7, we remember commutativity. Remember, that means that no matter which way I order the numbers, I get the same result. So in this instance, I want children to realise that 3 plus 7 is the same as 7 plus 3. Now I come to the conclusion and reflection. So this is my opportunity to draw ideas together, provide feedback to students, consolidate their understanding of addition to 10, do a brief activity, and I'll give you an example soon, offer reflection time and discussion time, and also questioning. So now, back to my lesson that you're visualising. I'll consolidate the learning by asking students to find their friend to make 10. So what I do is I'm going to gather the children together and give each child an A4 piece of paper with a numeral on it. So students then have to pair up with a friend who has their friend of 10. So for example, the child who is holding the A4 piece of paper with 8 written on it would pair up with the child who's holding the paper with 2 written on it. 3 would pair up with 7, for instance. 6 would pair up with 4. Do you get the gist? For my reflection, I'll ask them what kind of patterns they saw whilst making different combinations to 10. So once again, this is reiterating commutativity. So 8 plus 2 and 2 plus 8 are the same. We can talk about what kind of maths they needed to use in order to work things out. Now we're going to look at assessment and lesson evaluation. So assessment strategies are what the children have learned. So what will you look for that tells you children have learned something? What strategies will you use? So for example, observation, running records, photos, work samples. All right? Now there's a difference between assessment strategies and lesson evaluation. Now assessment strategies are the strategies that you're going to employ and things that you're writing, or I should say noticing, that the children have learned. The lesson evaluation is related more so to the teacher. So how the teacher can make the lesson better for next time. So you need to consider things such as timing, behaviour management strategies, achievement of outcomes, flow or transition from one section or one part of the lesson to the next, appropriate resources, for instance. Now remember how we did number caterpillars in our tutorial several weeks ago? This was where we had a special caterpillar that was only found in remote jungle areas, and its body grew according to rules. So just to jog your memory, I'd like you to complete a couple of caterpillars in your books now. Now I've broken down the number caterpillar activity we did in class several weeks ago. So this is to give you some context because you've already engaged in this activity, so you know what it's about. So hopefully you've managed to draw a couple of number caterpillars in your books and it's jogged your memory. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to focus on breaking down each section of the template and then reiterating the key components of the assignment. So for example, you need to ensure that whole number is integrated with one other substrand. Now that substrand can come from anywhere in the syllabus. So just because you're using whole number from number and algebra, it doesn't mean that you can't use any other number and algebra substrands, because you most certainly can. I'm also going to tell you a little bit about ensuring there's a logical sequence between all three lessons and flow within the lesson. So everything's got to flow together logically. We're also going to have a look at the descriptors and making sure they match the lesson content. In terms of the justification that you've got to do for assignment 2, it is only one justification for all three lessons, not for each lesson. So now let's have a look at this particular lesson plan. So I have a title. A title is always good. Right? Remember to identify the stage and year of the class. There's no point in you just saying stage 1 or stage 2, for example. I need to know which particular grade you're aiming that lesson at, because how you use the syllabus will then be influenced by that. So you need to be clear about your aim. So what exactly will the students be doing and how will they be doing it? What kind of processes will you use? Investigation or problem solving? Is there any expected knowledge, prior knowledge that the students need to have? Now remember, you need to have whole number as one substrand, and there needs to be another content outcome, I should say, from any other substrand in the syllabus. In terms of our process outcomes, you should have at least 2 process outcomes for each lesson. You might find that you can even work with all 3, and that's fine. You also need to make sure the content descriptors match the actual lesson activities. So these dot points that I'm putting down in my lesson needs to be happening in the lesson itself. I remember I've marked a few assignments in assessment 1 where we had quite a number of students who included dot points from the syllabus, but those things weren't actually happening in that particular resource. Right? So the dot points need to be happening somewhere in your lesson. Just a bit of a tip here, as you can see, the WM descriptors, so they're going to be the triangular points in the syllabus. They can be obtained from the content pages in the syllabus. For our content outcomes, so we have whole number and we have something else. that needs to be integrated. So you would have 3 to 6 content descriptors across all of your content outcomes. I am not going to have just one descriptor for each outcome, because that's not enough to tell me whether or not the child understands the content. Right? It's just like seeing someone do something the first time and thinking they know how to do it, but they can't do it again. It was just a fluke the first time. Another tip for the assignment: never have never have more than 2 content outcomes for any one lesson. So you're basically setting up yourself to fail if you do that, because it's not really doable. So as much as we advocate integration, and yes, definitely integration is a good thing, at the same time it's better to cover less content more deeply than it is to cover more content at a shallow level. Resources, this is a really easy section here. Resources, just list everything you need to make the lesson go smoothly. You don't need to list students and teacher. So for assessment strategies, think about how you're going to find out what your students have learned. Include the strategies here. Remember, you don't always need to have pen and paper evidence. It can be evidence from work samples. It can be annotated work samples. You might have observation notes. You might have photographs with annotations or photographs of their final product. You might have anecdotal evidence from discussions and reflection. Right? Remember, these are the things that, or the strategies that you will be looking for to find out whether or not the children have learned something. But I also want, in these assessment strategies, to write down what I'm looking for. Now, just a tip, you're going to get ideas for these assessment strategies and these pointers or statements from your content descriptors. So for example, my very first assessment strategy that I've written here in the example is: student work samples will be annotated to check their understanding of halving numbers. So if I go back to the rules of the game or the activity, it was to halve numbers, right, in order to actually participate with building or constructing this caterpillar. So that was one of the rules. So what I want to know is, when I have a look at the students' constructed number caterpillars, am I able to see that they understand what halving an even number is all about? Right? If I have a look in my outcomes, I might also get an idea that I've used the terms even and halving. So that's where my assessment strategy has come from. Student work samples is a strategy. What I'm looking for is their understanding of halving numbers. I also have that as a content descriptor. Okay, so for our teaching and learning activities, you need to make sure that your lesson is split into 3 sections: an introduction, a body, and a conclusion. So your introduction, as we've spoken about earlier, is literally an introduction of the concept that you're teaching. Now, you'll notice that I've used dot points here. I find that using dot points when planning lessons is great, because straight away you're able to see where you're up to without having to read half a paragraph. So no, I do not mind if you use dot points. Now, your introduction, body and conclusion should have a step-by-step guide on how to carry out the lesson. The best way to do that is through dot points. All right? Now, as a beginning teacher, in the real world, you might do up a lesson plan and then have that lesson plan beside you so you can turn to and have a look where you're up to in the lesson. And that's perfectly fine. And you might agree it would be a lot easier to do that and say, oh, right, okay, I'm reading the 4th dot point now. That means when I have a look back, I'm up to the 5th dot point. It's a lot easier to do that than it is to try and read through a solid paragraph of writing. So in the introduction, we have the modelled practice. So we're basically showing the students what it is that we want them to do. Teaching notes. The teaching notes section of the lesson plan literally means notes for teaching, notes that are going to help you deliver that lesson successfully. So what are the students going to be doing? What other practical considerations might I consider? So for example, if there is something I want the teacher to be specifically talking about in the introduction, I might say something about facilitating discussion around odd and even numbers. Maybe I have 2 children who don't work well seated next to each other. So in my teaching notes, I will be able to say, Tom and Sally are not to sit next to each other. Right? I've also written here in the teaching notes, students will sit in a circle on the floor. So what I'm doing there is I'm setting the scene as to how I want the lesson to begin. So now I come to the body. Now you will have noticed that in the introduction I had a time limit, and in the body I also have a time limit. So in this particular instance it was 10 minutes for the introduction. We know that the body is the longest part of the lesson, and in this particular instance I have stated that it's going to go on for 25 minutes. Now in case you're wondering, the average length of a lesson is around 45 minutes. Now it really does depend on the class, and it does depend on the content that you're teaching. You may find that some lessons could go for an hour. You may find that some short lessons could go on for 15-20 minutes. Right? But the average lesson is for about 45 minutes, and for the purposes of this assignment you need to create a lesson that's about 45 to 50 minutes in length. So we can see through the body here. If you have a read through the body, you'll get an idea of where the guided practice is happening. So when we work through guided practice, it means we're all having a go at the content together. Then towards the end of this section, you'll see that I'm now allowing the students to independently begin the task. And once again, if you have a look to the right hand column, that's my teaching notes column. So in my teaching notes here, I've spoken about how I'm going to group the students. I'm going to say maybe some students need assistance, for example, with calculators. Some of the questioning I might encourage might be, how do you know you can halve this number? I've also written in something about parent helpers. So if in the real world you do have parent helpers who are able to come into the classroom to help you, if you know that in advance, pop it into your lesson plan. I also have in my teaching notes pre-organised group roles. So I've got all of these roles here the students are aware of, and that just helps me manage the lesson more effectively. So in my conclusion time now, I've made time for reflection. So I'm going to pose some reflection questions that I might ask the students. So for example, what was the longest caterpillar your group found? What mats did you use to grow your caterpillar? Right? These are valid questions that really encourage a lot of reflection about what the children have already done within that activity that you've planned. Now at the end you'll notice that I've got a consolidation activity. So in this particular instance I've selected 7 children and randomly allocated prepared Brennex circles. So I've already worked out a number caterpillar in effect, and then what I'm doing is now I'm seeing if children remember the rule and if they're able to correctly order the numbers or correctly make a caterpillar, and everyone participates. So you've got the 7 children who have been randomly chosen with their circled paper with numbers on it, and then you've got the whole class who are participating and saying, oh, you need to go here or you need to go next to such and such. All right, it's a quick activity, and that would really literally take maybe about 3 minutes tops. All right, but it is a really good way to see if the children have understood what it is that you've been teaching in the lesson. So as I was saying, it is important to always include reflection as part of your conclusion, and a brief consolidation activity is always a good idea. Your brief consolidation activity, it's not compulsory, but I find that you get an idea of whether or not the children have actually understood what you spent the last half an hour teaching. Okay, so this is where we come to the lesson evaluation. So remember, this section is about how the lesson went. So you'll need to include a set of evaluation questions, and that's going to help you gauge whether or not the lesson worked, and more importantly, how you might actually improve it for next time. Now, you need to have these lesson evaluation questions as specific as possible to each lesson, although you may find that a lot of these will overlap between lessons. For the purposes of your assignment, however, please do not just cut and paste your evaluation questions from one lesson to the next, because there are going to be differences in each of your lesson. So in this particular example, I've considered timing. Was the content appropriate for Year 2? I could also consider things like achievement of planned learning outcomes, time management, behaviour management strategies, classroom space and organisation, student participation, catering for additional needs and or different learning styles, any safety precautions, and future lesson considerations. Now, for this assignment, because you are not required to implement these lesson plans, all right, so in other words, you're not going to go on prac and actually carry these out. No need for that. Your evaluation questions still need to be there though. The difference is you will have nothing to answer them with because you're not actually implementing the lesson. So you must still have the questions there, but don't feel you need to answer them. Now let's talk a little bit about differentiation. So what can we do to differentiate the tasks? We can change the level of difficulty according to student needs. We can use more open-ended tasks, or we can use tools like Gardner's Multiple Intelligences, Bloom's Taxonomy, and the Thinker's Keys. You should be familiar with each of these by now. So for example, for Gardner's Multiple Intelligences, I might adapt the activity to suit a particular intelligence, and I will give you examples in the coming slides. For Bloom's Taxonomy, you might be able to differentiate from going from the remembering level to evaluating and creating levels. For Thinker's Keys, if you Google Tony Ryan, you're going to get a whole heap of information about Thinker's Keys, and this is something that we would have already done in our tutes last week. If I was to use an open-ended task, I might have a problem like, in my pocket I have 75 cents, what coins might I have? So this is a really good open-ended task because there's a lot of I guess a lot of methods behind it. You can access a lot of different ways to work it out. If it was a closed task, it would look very different. Right? So in this particular instance, what we've done is we've given the answer first, we've made it open-ended and rich. This actually gives you a lot of insight into a child's thinking if you do a task like this. It also suits multiple abilities, and if you need to, you can definitely include concrete materials. Now, of course, I'll let you have a read of this slide at your own pace, but this is where we're linking differentiation activities to blooms. So in this example, I've used times tables. So what I want for children to be able to move from the remember stage to the ability to create something that shows their understanding of times tables. So the remember stage might be recalling facts. Understanding, I might have a look at rules for times tables. Applying, how can I apply that to different contexts or in real life? Analyze, so now I'm investigating. Evaluating, so what kind of recommendations do I have and why? And then creating, so creating something to do with times tables. Now let's link to Gardner's multiple intelligences. So here we're showing how each of the substrands of time in the measurement strand can be used with each of the intelligences. This also shows some really good ideas for integration. So I'll let you have a read of this slide at your own pace as well. And it just links to Gardner's multiple intelligences. Okay, where can you get ideas from? So here are just a few websites that you can get ideas for teaching and learning activities. So most of these are free, if not a free trial. Illuminations and Enrich is pretty good, as is Curriculum Support. And you can get some really valuable activities from Scootle too. In relation to the assignment, remember that one of your lesson plans needs to include technology in some capacity, but it needs to be technology that the children engage with, not technology that just the teacher uses. So for example, you wouldn't be able to say that you're using technology if the teacher is the only one using the interactive whiteboard. If the children aren't using it, then you haven't integrated technology into your lesson. You can also get ideas from books and professional associations, and just to give AAMT, or the Australian Association of Mathematics Teachers, a bit of a plug, you can get some great student deals through them for membership. I think at last count it was about $50 or $60 or so for a student membership, and for that you get journals for the year and access to their website. Whatever you do, don't lose this page. This is a great resource for you guys because it provides all of the resources needed for each lesson. It also has rubrics, and you're going to get lots of good ideas from these websites for assessment for learning. So definitely go around and navigate through these pages, because you're going to get a whole heap of great ideas that are going to help you when you actually get out into the workforce. Okay, so now I'd like you to participate in an activity. So you might be watching this and listening to this on your own, so it's going to be a little bit hard to think, pair, share. But in case you are in a group situation, and even if you are by yourself, it doesn't matter. What I'd like you to do is have a read of the outcome that I've got here, MA3 4NA, and I'd like you to brainstorm a whole range of activities to teach to that outcome. Alright, so essentially I've got the outcome, and then I've got two descriptors. So state the place value in digits in numbers of any size, and arrange numbers of any size in ascending and descending order. So what kind of activities can you come up with that is going to teach children those things? I also like you to think about working mathematically outcomes. So which would be your main focus? So what is it? Communicating? Is it problem solving? Is it reasoning? Do you have 2 out of the 3 that are your main focus? Does your activity suit all 3, for instance? Remember, for the purposes of assignment 2, I'd like you to include 2 or 3 working mathematically process outcomes. In terms of the content outcomes, you're going to have 2, whole number and another one of your choice. And let's do one more. So now, how would you adjust your teaching ideas to include the following outcome? So this time we're looking at addition and subtraction for stage 3. And I'd like you to think about adding 3 or more numbers and recording the strategies used to solve addition and subtraction word problems. So those are our content descriptors. What can we do to incorporate that with our whole number strand? Does it make sense? Right? Do the same with working mathematically. So have your working mathematically outcomes changed? Are they the same? Is there something you want to add? So we've come to the end of our online lecture, and I'd like you to now just make a start on a draft of your second assignment, because if you have any questions, they're about to come up now. I'm also going to open up a discussion board on views, and I will be monitoring that this coming Wednesday, which will be the 26th of April. And just if you have any questions about your assignment, if something isn't clear, that's the forum to ask for me to be monitoring this Wednesday, which will be good. I will not be monitoring the forum on Thursday and Friday. I will also at some point this week put up the FAQs for assignment 2, so hopefully that will give you some guidance as well. Okay, enjoy, and I'll see you next week.